This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Erik Spanberg, in for Mike Collins. Today, it's the local news roundup after another eventful week in Charlotte and across North Carolina. Brace yourselves, we still have no idea when the midterm elections will finally be finished, at least in North Carolina. That's because the 9th Congressional District results remain uncertified and finger-pointing over illegal tactics took on greater intensity in recent days. Voter ID is now the law of the land in North Carolina, or is it? The I-77 toll lanes hit the brakes, and the Carolina Panthers skidded to their 6th straight loss on Monday night. Joining me today are Ann Doss-Helms of the Charlotte Observer.
Good morning.
Alex Olgan from WFAE.
Hello.
Mary C. Curtis of Roll Call and WCCB, among others.
Good morning.
And WFAE's David Borax.
Hey, Eric.
So, the 9th District. We have another week of drama in the 9th District. It's still nothing really resolved. But we did hear from Mark Harris, I guess, right after this show ended last week. He spoke to WBTV, and one of the things that he discussed was his hiring of McCrae Dallas, who is the political operative who is accused of all kinds of election tampering with absentee ballots. Here is what Mark Harris said to WBTV.
He was being vouched for by a number of other leaders down there. So, I had no reason to think that what he was doing was illegal.
So, Mary, I'll start with you. What did we learn from Mark Harris and from the rest of the cast of characters this week about the 9th Congressional District?
Well, I think it's interesting that he named all of those folks who vouched for him by name, and so it's sort of like, it wasn't me. I wasn't the only one. And we've seen, after he spoke about the North Carolina Republican Party not backing him, we saw the party actually, the NCGOP, go back to where it started, which was to say the race should be certified. Because as all the irregularities came to the fore, you had seen them saying, well, perhaps we do need a new race because of, the reporting of the absentee ballots and all of these other things. But now they've come back to say, listen, these folks need representation. Union County Commission has said we need representation. The Mark Harris should be certified. But, folks are saying not so fast because it's gotten even more complicated, and there's even another county that they're looking into the absentee ballots and the voting in a sheriff's race in Columbus County. So the scandal seems to be growing.
So we have 3 counties now. We have Bladen, we have Robeson, and we have Columbus.
Yes.
And of course, the 9th District goes from Charlotte to Fayetteville. Dan McCready conceded, then he retracted his concession. David, the Elections Board previously was scheduled to have its hearing, Happy Holidays, today.
Yeah, that's right.
They rescheduled it to January 11th. What's your best guess on the chances that this thing is resolved in January? And by this thing, I mean a decision that is binding.
In January, it's a good question. This will be a hearing where they will present what they know so far and take testimony from other folks about what's going on. So this could just be the beginning of a process that leads to an eventual decision. It does seem like the investigators are out there right now, and it does seem like they're still uncovering things even as we go into the Christmas break here. So my best guess is maybe by the end of January, but probably not too much sooner.
Well, and not to mention that if you don't have representation, obviously someone from the 9th District can't represent you in votes, but who's going to handle your issues with your passport and other sort of things that congressmen and congresswomen deal with for their constituents?
Which I guess they're sending constituents to the offices of the North Carolina senators is the policy that I read, but still, you're right. Seems like a mess.
Yeah, because Pittenger's moved out,
Yeah.
and Mark Harris was all ready to move in. I think our article noted that he'd even picked out his paint colors.
Yes.
But now it's not
Very
as
important.
clear that he's going to get that color.
So lines at Tillis's office, I guess.
And it's become quite a national issue because the new House Speaker, of course, the U.S. House is changing hands. It'll be in Democratic control. So Nancy Pelosi, we presumably, who will be the new Speaker, really, she doesn't have to really seat anyone. So that's it. And you've also seen, I think it's very interesting, because I've been getting all these national calls for fundraising, and the national Democrats are fundraising off of this race.
As are the Republicans.
Yes, as are the Republicans. Dan McCready, they're bringing him up. And I saw a note from Ohio's Tim Ryan and others, because that's another thing. If they have to have another race, there'll be, campaigning, all new campaigning, so it'll be much more complicated. But it is such a national issue, and it also brings North Carolina into the spotlight again for something that probably it would rather not be, especially when you see all these interviews with the folks who were hired by Dallas, and a lot of them seem like they didn't quite know what exactly they were doing, saying they didn't know it was illegal, this ballot harvesting. So it's really opened up, really a can of worms.
Yeah, I was going to say, Mary, there's a lot of information coming out as just day by day here. In that interview that you mentioned before, Erik, on WBTV, Harris talked about, yes, I did hire him, and he talked about how after the 2016 primary, which he lost to Robert Pittenger, absentee ballots were a big factor in that one, and he had to be saying to himself, hey, how do I get some of that? What happened here? And he asked around, and that's when he was introduced to Dallas. And I think that's when the seeds were planted for his decision in 2018 to hire Dallas. We also have a report that came out. The Elections Board is putting out documents on their website day by day as information comes in, and there was a report from January that says that a couple of people were talking about how Dallas had coached them on what to say to investigators, and
yes.
That does not look good in this case.
In 2016, and correct me, David or Mary or anyone, I think that was when there was the third candidate in the primary, Johnson, who Dallas was working for, and he basically got all of the absentee votes in Bladen County, and Pittenger and Harris got a handful.
I mean, had that not happened, I think Harris would have had a chance in that primary in 2016. It's important to note here that, going back a few elections, that Dallas has been involved in elections on both the Democratic and Republican sides. So it seems to me that what we're looking at here is at very least a culture of absentee ballot activity that looks kind of shady.
Also, it's become clear that he was under investigation years ago, and a lot of people are saying, why is it just coming out now? Because it shows that 2016, some of his practices were so questionable that they got the evidence and turned it over to federal prosecutors, and nothing really was done. But people are asking about that because, as David said, these questions go back for several election cycles.
Well, and it was interesting because Walter McDuffie, who is the head of the Bladen County Republican Party, came out this week and essentially blamed the Elections Board for not doing enough in 2016 as the cause of what's going on in 2018, which I thought was an interesting set of circumstances. So he says the debacle really starts with the Elections Board. So,
well, and I think it's pretty clear that Mr. Dallas has had a reputation for being somebody who knows the law and knows the system so well that he can go just up to that line. And there are a lot of things you can do that are not across the line. And what we're seeing now is increasing evidence that he or people who worked for him stepped across that line. And I think that's, on the investigative side, that's a lot of what we're going to be seeing is blame shoving, as, gosh, I hired these people, and it's a shame they didn't understand and they did something they weren't supposed to do. And meanwhile, you have some of these new affidavits, people saying, well, he told us not to tell anybody that we were getting paid for actually bringing in the ballots themselves as opposed to the absentee ballot application.
Yeah, it feels like college basketball recruiting to me.
And Dallas himself is, through his lawyer, basically saying, I'm innocent, all will be revealed. So
Yes. You just mentioned McRae, Dallas's lawyer, said this week that her client hasn't broken any campaign laws and called Dallas, quote, a highly respected member of our community who is routinely sought after for his campaign expertise, end quote. So that will probably be referred to in news stories for the next year.
Oh, yeah. And it's interesting, though, because, we talk about ex-felons being able to get, great jobs and getting to he really did pretty well.
Can't vote, but can help with the election.
Now, at the same time this is going on, we have voter ID, of course, is still playing out this week. The legislature overrode the governor's veto. Maybe this is the last in the series. I'm not sure with the change in legislatures. But let's hear from Republican legislator David Lewis. Here's what he had to say about Governor Cooper's veto.
We are all responsible for respecting and implementing the will of the people of North Carolina regarding common sense voter ID. This legislation does just that, and it deserves to become law.
And Governor Cooper, as you would imagine, had a different perspective on this.
I think they put the people into a corner. Most legislators, before they put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, They write the laws, they prepare the rules, they let the people know what it is they are voting on. What the legislature did was force the voters to give them a blank check.
So we've talked about this over and over on this show. Mary, we had the law in 2013. It wound up being struck down by federal judges. That was also, I think, the infamous language about surgical precision.
Almost surgical precision going after minority voters, yes.
So where do you think this version is headed?
Well, it's already headed to the courts. Within a second of it, the veto being overridden, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice had filed a suit against it in state court. The NAACP and other branches are also filing federal lawsuits. And, you know, let's face it, the Republicans in the state have been pretty much relentless in the search after the Supreme Court invalidated key portions of the Voting Rights Act to go after these voter ID bills. It's sort of like Javert, going after Jean Valjean. It's like, I will get this. And I wrote that in roll call because it's true. And so, yes, it was on the ballot, and voters approved it. As the governor said, the language was very vague. So we'll see what happens as this law goes into the courts. But it's just, I feel, really interesting that the big scandal now is over perhaps actual election fraud. And this bill doesn't really deal too much with the absentee ballot process. And this is what they want to go after.
This bill actually asks the Elections Board to come up with some rules that would address the issue of absentee ballot fraud, and we don't know what those are either. No. And David Lewis in that cut that we just played is right. 55% of voters went for this. The Republicans put this on the ballot because they knew that polls showed that if you ask voters, should you have to show an ID, without being specific about that, most voters say, well, yeah, that sounds sensible to us. It's how it's being carried out, as you said. And, there's still things to find out about this. I think in 2019, the big story that we'll see as this makes its way through the courts and in an attempt to overturn it, we'll also see a new kind of voter turnout campaign by folks on the left side who will go out and try to make sure that, okay, if you have to have an ID, let's make sure people can get those. But that is not the same thing as saying everybody has a right to vote and, we'll make it easy for you. And in many cases, it may still be difficult, even with the help of outsiders, to get the ID that you need to do this.
I'd love to see a tally of how much the state has spent on voter ID lawsuits in 2013. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and the other thing you're all hinting at this. I wonder how much distinction voters are making right now between fixing the absentee ballot fraud and what voter ID does. Any sense out there of what people...
To some extent, yeah. Republicans have been saying voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, and now there may be people saying, yes, they were right, see? But, of course, this voter fraud that is actually being investigated has nothing to do with people coming up and saying there's somebody else and voting in person, which is what all of the voter ID bills are about.
And all the data shows that hardly ever happens, that hardly ever happens. And it also shows that actually the reason the federal court threw out the last bill was that it looked like they saw which forms of ID that were difficult to get for minorities, people of color, the young, the elderly, and that's what they went after. And so, yeah.
To be continued. By the way, another thing to be continued, construction of the I-77 toll lanes, yet another one. It's like HB2, just drop money in the jar. Stay with us. We'll be back to talk about that and more here on the Local News Roundup. You're listening to Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Powers Law Firm PA, dedicated to providing client-focused legal representation involving child custody, support, and equitable distribution to clients. CharlotteDivorceTeam.com. And Tyndall Subaru Gastonia, featuring the new Outback with eyesight safety technology that sees problems and initiates action to help avoid trouble. Details at TyndallSubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. On the next Charlotte Talks, United Way of Central Carolina's got a new CEO this fall. We sit down with Laura Clark to talk about what it's like taking over the job, how she sees United Way's mission in Charlotte, and how its focus has shifted to neighborhoods. We also hear from other social service organizations about larger issues like federal grant cuts and the shifting funding landscape. That archive edition of Charlotte Talks coming up Monday at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Facebook's bad year gets worse. Prosecutors find shocking patterns of illegality in the president's personal charitable foundation. Lawmakers agree on a first step, and the speaker says farewell.
Here's to the people. Here's to the people's house. Here's to possibilities.
The Friday News Roundup next time on 1A.
The Roundup of the Week's news continues with 1A coming up at 10 here on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins, and today it is the Local News Roundup. My panel includes David Borax from WFAE, Ann Doss Helms of the Charlotte Observer, Mary C. Curtis of WCCB and Roll Call, and Alex Olgan from WFAE. So when we went to the break, I made mention of the dreaded I-77 toll lanes delays, dreaded for commuters, that is. So David, you've covered this a lot. $670 million project, 26 miles. Originally, it was supposed to be finished by the end of 2018. We got some news this week. Before I get your perspective, I want to play you a little thought from Kurt Nas, who's been a persistent critic of this project.
Anybody who drives in this area could take a look and say there's no possible way that this is going to open by the end of the year. So this comes as absolutely no surprise to anybody.
Is he right?
He took the words right out of my mouth. You know, I drive on this often because I live up in North Mecklenburg. And after you and I actually interviewed Javier Tamargo from I-77 Mobility Partners back in November, or actually October, when they first suggested that they might not open the whole thing on time. And the idea was that they could get the North Mecklenburg portion open first. And honestly, that's the most congested portion of the road where having these lanes open potentially could have an immediate effect. And since in the weeks since we were told that, and since they did announce that they were going to only open part of it at the end of the year, it's been looking increasingly less likely that it would be opened at all by the end of the year. Part of that is to blame for an expansion of the project. There's some features to it that have been added that the state wanted that are being constructed right now, which are not ready yet. Also in play here is the weather. I mean, the snowstorm there really threw another monkey wrench into things here. So in many ways, this mirrors every kind of public infrastructure project like this where weather and other things cause these delays, and, you know, it'll open when it opens. And so the current thinking is that the northern section, maybe from about Hambright Road in Huntersville north to Mooresville, will be open sometime in the first quarter, and that the whole all the sections of the road will be open by the middle of the year, and we'll see if that holds up.
And I think one of the notable things that came out even before this latest announcement was when they started to get the sense that they weren't going to finish on time, it was disclosed that the penalties had been extended from, I think it was originally going to be January 7th, 2019,
That's right.
$10,000 a day to, what is it now?
Now it's October, I believe. And
that's a little later.
In their press release announcing this latest delay, they said, we are absolutely on track to hit the opening date in October. So actually, think about it. They've got another 3 months built into their schedule here. So we may have an announcement later that says, actually, we're not going to open until October. So who knows?
So really, it's going to be early, David, if you follow the logic here. And let's talk a little bit about education. You wrote an interesting story this week about 2,400 teachers across the state failing a math exam. I'm glad they joined me in that distinction. How big of a problem is this, and why are they talking about possibly dropping the test?
Well, the idea is that you have licensure exams because you're trying to screen out teachers who potentially are not going to do a good job. So they have 3 exams that are given right now. They're all done by a Pearson publishing company. There's a reading portion, there's a math portion, and then there's what they call a multi-subject that covers science and social studies. So they added this Pearson exam in 2013, and math pass rates became very low, much lower than on the other sections. And so you had people saying, if you look at these tests, this is not what you need to know to be a great kindergarten or second grade math teacher. This is showing whether you're good at, math functions, math problems that are done in middle and high school. And we interviewed and talked to teachers who said, I've got glowing reviews, my principals want to keep me. I keep taking this exam and I keep failing it, and I'm going to end up having to leave the profession. So the state board took this very seriously. They asked some academic researchers to do a study to see whether, in fact, these exams seem to have any correlation with effective teaching. And what they looked at all 3 sections, and the only strong correlation they found, they looked at, did teachers who passed on the first try have better results with their kids than teachers who failed and had to potentially keep trying or never pass. And they also looked at was there any correlation between a high score and a high job evaluation. With the math, they found no significant correlation. With the multi-subject, they found no significant correlation. The only link they found was with reading. They found that teachers who did better on the reading exam tended to have better results, especially with the youngest readers. So this has not actually gone to the state board yet. What you had was a panel of higher education and K-12 educators who are looking at professional standards, and they said, let's just drop the multi-subject altogether. That's not required by law. Let's keep the Pearson reading because it appears to have some link to effective teaching, and let's replace the math exam with another math exam that's called the praxis exam, had been used earlier. So this is, needless to say, a topic of much interest among teachers. I've been seeing a lot of traffic on that, a lot of people saying, oh, thank goodness, that because this is not something that the state pay for. This is something
That's what I was going to ask you. I thought
for.
your story mentioned that the teachers, each time they would fail, then they not only have to take the test again, they have to pay for it again, right?
Right, and in some cases, now Pearson does provide at no cost test prep classes, as does the state, but a lot of them are going to outside test prep classes because they really want to keep their livelihood, so they're writing another check. So, yeah, this is, and this is the real question. There are some people who say this is dumbing down. There's no reason if a teacher is a college graduate that they shouldn't be able to do middle and high school math. This is not a bad standard to have. And the board that reviewed this did say there is some value. We do have an interest in making sure that the teachers who are going to be teaching our kids can do a good job of it. We just have to figure out the right combination to make sure we're really getting the effective teachers.
That is the voice of Ann Doss-Helms. She is the education reporter at the Charlotte Observer. We're on the local news roundup. David Borax and Alex Olgan from WFAE are with us, and also Mary C. Curtis from Roll Call and WCCB. Let's stay in the classroom for a few more minutes. You also took a look this week at charter school enrollment, both here. You mentioned some results from Wake County. What's going on in that area?
So what we've been seeing in recent years is a real leveling off of enrollment growth. We had been seeing for years and years in North Carolina just, not only were there more types of schools, including more charter schools, but there were just more kids coming in between birth rates and immigration, and that seems to be slowing down here and across the country. So we did see statewide a growth in the number of charter school students, as we've seen. This year we had almost 112,000 students in 190 charter schools. That's up from about 102,000 and 177 charter schools across the state last year. Mecklenburg did see some growth in charter school enrollment, 19,443 in about 40 charter schools, and again, that's up a bit, but not up as much as CMS had projected. And what you see, both in CMS and in charter schools, is we have the biggest charter schools here in the Charlotte area and the biggest district schools in North Carolina, but not all of them are doing well. And so what we're seeing is some charter schools that are losing enrollment, either because they're new ones obviously aren't losing, but we had one new school, very cool Chinese immersion, East Voyager Academy, but it opened in an area that has traditionally not had particularly strong public or charter schools. It had hoped to have, I think, 365. It now has, it now has about 120, but the first month count was like 89, which is barely enough to meet the minimum. You have some established schools that are losing enrollment because they've either had management issues and or had low test score performance. So the real variable here is how do you plan? Because you can't assume that a long waiting list at the big charter schools like Lake Norman or Pine Lake Prep or Lincoln charter schools means that there's going to be huge demand for every charter school. And Wake County has kind of been behind Charlotte on this. Wake has had this huge enrollment growth, but this year they also leveled out. They were expecting about 1,900 additional students. They got 42.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, this issue, charter schools, has been a big change for big school systems like CMS and Wake County. And as you just mentioned, this is all about how do the big school systems plan when charter schools are doing these strange things. I'm wondering, my question for you is, do we think that it's leveling out at a point now where the planning process could be easier for the big school systems and, they could actually predict more what's going to be happening in the years ahead?
I think if you actually thought we were going to just stay level forever, that would be almost a much easier situation during those years of growth.
Or
all
a
the big
predictable
districts,
growth rate.
Yeah, the districts fell way behind, so you were always playing catch up. These bond issues that play out over the course of years, and they're trying to catch up with areas that are highly overcrowded. The question is, if you have a pie that's not growing and potentially shrinking, and you have more and more people getting a slice of it, do you end up with school closings, either with charter school closings, which are disruptive because they then spill into, kids are going back into the public schools, or do you see what we saw in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools during the recession when some public schools were closed, and that was tremendously traumatic for the communities that saw their schools closed.
One more thought about this. Is the fact that this may be leveling off, what does the pipeline of new charter schools look like? Is that any different?
Well, and that's going to be up to the state. You have the State Charter School Advisory Board and then ultimately the State Board of Education. There has been a slowdown in the number of applications for new charter schools and the number being approved. I do think the advisory board is trying to be pretty thoughtful about this. There's always been that tension between sort of the market people that say, unless this is just blatantly ridiculous, put them all out there and let the market decide. And I think the state has used more discretion than that. They've tried to say, does this really have a strong hope of surviving, and does it bring a value? What they would love to see is some more charter schools in these rural areas that may have weak public districts and don't have any, but there's not as much, of a force to do that in those counties as there is in a Wake or a Mecklenburg, where you kind of feel like there are people who would finance it. There's a lot of property available. Let's get in on this.
Speaking of enrollment, Alex, we had some health news this week about the Affordable Care Act.
Obama. Yeah, apparently it's unconstitutional.
Yes, we had a lot of news, I should say, about the Affordable Care Act. Let's start with North Carolina. The numbers are down a little bit. What do you how significant is that decline?
So one caveat is that the Department of Insurance has allowed a special enrollment period for people who were affected by the snow. And then there's, a bunch of things that have to happen before the numbers are final. So the numbers we have right now are a little preliminary, but we had about a 4% drop. So 502,000 and change people signed up for health insurance in North Carolina. About a 4% drop. That matches the national trend. But what's interesting to me is that in South Carolina, it was less than a 1% decrease. So I'm not really sure why that's the case so far. But so yes, enrollment was down, but not really as much as expected. People thought without the individual mandate, with all these short-term plans at the bottom would just fall out. But it sounds like people still want insurance. They want health insurance. They've come to rely on it. So no, enrollment is not down nearly as much as some experts predicted.
Yeah, that follows a trend nationally where it did not drop as much as people thought it would, because not just of all these individual mandates and other things coming up, but the fact that the Trump administration had cut funds to publicize the Affordable Care Act by some 90% or so. And so they were expecting a much bigger drop. But then you hark back to what was said when the original arguments over the Affordable Care Act, that once people get a benefit of any sort, it is really difficult to take it away. And it became a huge issue, of course, health care in the midterm elections, which is what Democrats talked about quite a bit. So you see that health care, of course, is on everyone's minds, the issue of pre-existing conditions and all of that. So even with all the uncertainty, as Alex said, people do depend on it.
And you have a job market where employment is high, but a lot of those jobs do not come with benefits. So there really is an issue. Health insurance is not a nice benefit to have. It's essential.
The gig economy,
you cannot keep yourself from being sick or injured, and no matter how healthy a lifestyle you follow, and a major medical incident is something that almost none of us have the savings to cover.
And there is some speculation that the booming economy and more people being employed, that some of those people are getting employer-sponsored health insurance, and that may have contributed to the decline.
Right. The Affordable Care Act is more than just the marketplace. It's pre-existing conditions. It is keeping your kids on your health insurance until you're 26. It's calorie counts on menus. The Affordable Care Act touches almost every part of our healthcare system. And so, with the ruling in Texas, where the judge said it was unconstitutional, of course, this will be appealed. But it leaves a lot of uncertainty, because a lot of people just bought health insurance on this marketplace. What will happen? So far, we understand that it's not like their health insurance is going to evaporate on January 1st. They should still have coverage. But, states could choose not to enforce certain things about the Affordable Care Act. And a lot of hospitals and doctors have come to, made lots of changes because of the Affordable Care Act. It was very expensive, and I think that you would see industry be pretty upset if all of a sudden all the changes that they made sort of went away, or they didn't need to make the changes. It was an expensive endeavor.
In a sense, it's sort of like the dog that caught the car. They finally got this ruling, and all these folks who had been campaigning against the Affordable Care Act realized, it really might be a problem even amongst our voters if it went away.
And Alex, let's go back to where you started, which is the ruling that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. We've also seen Josh Stein, who is a Democrat and the Attorney General of North Carolina. He has joined in with, I think, 17 other attorneys general across the country seeking clarification. So what exactly is he looking for, and how likely is he to find it?
So the he didn't issue an injunction, the judge in Texas. He just kind of declared that it's unconstitutional because the individual mandate changes. But it's really unclear what it means. And so these Democratic attorneys general want some clarification. There's all these very specific issues about how to appeal it, so it's not totally clear how that will happen yet. But yeah, Josh Stein and the other attorneys general said, can you just, what does this mean? We need to understand what this means because, like I said, it could have huge impacts. And North Carolina, has been considering expanding Medicaid. That won't happen if the Affordable Care Act is actually not, is unconstitutional because that's federal money that we would rely on. And just one more thing about the enrollment numbers, the federal exchange, the 8.4 million people that signed up, that's only the federal exchange. There are lots of other state exchanges, and those numbers we don't have yet. Medicaid expansion numbers we don't have yet. So the 8.4 is only a subset of the people that have gotten insurance because of the Affordable Care Act or through the Affordable Care Act.
David, I wanted to ask you this week, we had the unexpected death of former Duke Energy CEO Jim Rogers at age 71. For people who may not have been in town in the mid-2000s, Jim Rogers was a real power player, power broker, and he was a key figure not just in the utility industry. He was a major player in the Democratic National Convention coming to Charlotte in 2012. So just some thoughts on his legacy.
Yeah, Jim Rogers came from outside of Charlotte. He was raised in Kentucky, and he was the CEO of Synergy, which was based in Cincinnati, which Duke Energy acquired, and he became the CEO of Duke Energy after that. He immediately got himself involved in Charlotte affairs and North Carolina affairs, and probably the thing that people remember most about him as far as community activity goes is that he did co-chair the local host committee for the Democratic National Convention in 2012, and that included giving a welcoming speech, and so that speech was something that many people remember. It also included Duke Energy basically picking up the tab for the Democratic National Committee when it fell short on money that year. And that, of course, has prompted questions here about whether somebody will do that if that happens with the Republican National Committee in 2020. But there seems to be a slightly different structure there this time. But the other thing about Jim Rogers is that he was trying to balance between keeping energy prices affordable and also doing some innovation with renewable energy. And he managed to do that. He was a little bit of an outlier in the energy industry at that time, and he'll be remembered both within the industry and in the Charlotte area.
So we will switch gears when we come back. We're going to take a look at the unhappy holiday season for the Carolina Panthers, who have now lost 6 straight, and we have some other news to get to, including Atrium Health heading into Georgia. Stay with us here on Charlotte Talks.
Roundup continues in a moment on 90.7 WFAE. Our support comes from WFAE members and Charlotte Center City partners presenting CLT NYE, Charlotte's official New Year's Eve celebration, December 31st at Levine Avenue of the Arts. Details at holidaysinthecity.clt.com. And Trinity Episcopal School presenting Freedom Fest 2019, the American Story of Immigration, with guest speaker Matt De La Pena discussing immigration in America, January 24th, 7 to 9 p.m. More at tescharlotte.org. The roundup of the week's news continues next at 10 with 1A and a look at news from around the nation, from the delay of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's sentencing to a possible government shutdown and the resignation of General Jim Mattis. Joshua Johnson and guests will discuss those stories and more coming up at 10 on 1A, here on 90.7 WFAE.
Hi, I'm Joni Deutsch, host of the Amplifier podcast. And on the latest episode, we chat with country rock band Amigo about their role in the Charlotte music scene.
What our role is just being a part of things and being supportive and being a voice for inclusiveness and positivity.
Listen to the Amplifier podcast on NPR One and WFAE.org/amplifier. Amplifier is powered by Ortho Carolina.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins. This is the Friday Local News Roundup, and our panel today includes Alex Olgan from WFAE, Mary C. Curtis of Roll Call and WCCB, Ann Doss Helms from the Charlotte Observer, and David Borax from WFAE. So, Monday night, Bank of America Stadium, the nation looks on, and it didn't go so well. Although the Panthers at least played them close. So the Saints are one of the best teams in the NFL, and it was a 3-point loss. So, David, I want to ask you a little bit about where things are headed, but first let's hear Ron Rivera's response to a reporter's question that began with, I know this is a stupid question, but...
That is a stupid question. That really is, and I'm not going to answer that one. I'm very happy where I am. I really do appreciate my place here on this football team and in this city and in this community.
The question was about whether he wanted to return as head coach. I don't think people are doubting whether he wants to return. The question is, does David Tepper, the Panthers owner, want him to return? So, David, how did 6-2 turn into such a mess?
Yeah. You know, in another instance, Rivera actually did say it's up to David Tepper whether I come back or not, which is a hint that there may be some discussions going on right now about Ron Rivera's future. But, you know, they had a great start this year, but I think the story has been Cam Newton's shoulder. And a lot of people may not realize it, but in recent weeks, he hasn't been practicing at midweek. And if you looked at the injury report, you know, on Thursday, it would say Cam Newton, you know, light practice only, if any practice. And he had rotator cuff surgery a couple of years ago. And as he said in interviews this week, you know, it's just not normal. You know, he just can't do it. And anybody that watched Monday's game knew that there was something wrong there. And, you know, the ball would be thrown into the ground or he'd miss his mark on passes that we're used to him hitting. Now, the Panthers have been playing well. And in that game, you know, actually overall, I think it was a lousy game because of all the missed opportunities for the Panthers. And the defense played great. I mean, they held the Saints, who've clinched the division title, they held them to just 12 points. And I think that's a good thing, but you need the offense as well. And it just was a frustrating game for the Panthers.
There were a few amazing plays. It was actually fun to watch, whereas to me some of the more recent ones where we should have won and we just flopped were just depressing. But the one where I think Cam passed to Christian McCaffrey and then he passed to someone else. I mean,
Touchdown.
that was exciting to watch. You were like, oh, did I just see that?
And you want to say if that defense had shown up with some of the games that they had lost that were so close, that folks came back at the last minute. But you can't do that. You can't take a part of some game and put it to another game. And you really feel badly. These players, a lot of them are getting older. You think they might retire. And you really wanted to see a chance for them to get to the playoffs one last time.
So it's not a surprise that we woke up on Tuesday morning and the question was, what's going on with Rivera? You know, he's already fired some coaches this year. And the question really is it the coach that's doing this? Is there something else we can do to fix the situation? It raises questions about Cam Newton. You know, we're going to have our backup quarterback for the next few weeks. Cam will not play the rest of the games in order to try and see if they can fix that shoulder. So we may get a chance to see some new ideas in the lineup and all of that and, you know, see how they play for the last couple of games. Interestingly enough, they've got Atlanta this weekend, which is always a big end-of-season rivalry, and then they play the Saints again at the last game of the season, and then we'll watch somebody else in the playoffs.
And who is our backup quarterback? I found myself not knowing that because Cam Newton has just
I can't pronounce his name, but he looks like he's about 12. I hope that's a good thing, but he looks very, very young.
Not Colin Kaepernick.
Yes.
Although it could be, right?
That's right. That would help the news roundup. Alex, I have to put you on the spot. I mean, you're going through all this important healthcare news, and yet you've given us no prognosis on Cam Newton's shoulder.
Because I haven't seen him yet.
Okay,
I haven't seen his medical records. Maybe if he shares them with me.
Okay, very good. Very good. So, Alex, I mentioned the Georgia Atrium project, which, of course, I think that happened right after the merger fell through, right? The North Carolina merger.
Right. It's been a busy year. So remember, Atrium used to be Carolina's Healthcare, and then they wanted to go into Georgia, and they thought, we can't call ourselves Carolina's Healthcare. So they changed their name to Atrium. And then they announced they tried to do this deal with Georgia in February, and then the UNC deal fell apart. And there was this question of like, well, what's happening with this Georgia hospital? It's in Macon. It has about 30 locations, about 7 hospitals. It's much smaller than Atrium is, but We got word that it was finalized yesterday. You know, everyone signed the contracts. It had to get approval from the Georgia Attorney General. Atrium says this is just the beginning of their expansion into central and southern Georgia. So it'll be interesting to see how big they get and what benefit it brings to people in Georgia, because they, you know, Macon's has a high poverty rate. One thing Atrium says is they want to bring more telemedicine. They talk about increasing affordability, but I'm not really sure how that would happen. So they start integrating on January 1. I don't think it's going to have that much of an effect for people in Charlotte. They're really not going to really notice the difference.
So we've had Cam Newton shoulder, then we go to health with Georgia Atrium, and then, Ann, we have to talk about the health of the water in schools. So more results from lead testing. What do they find?
Well, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools has now completed 2 rounds. They did 1 round in fall of 2017, and that became controversial because they didn't tell people the results. So after a lot of hullabaloo over that, they said, we're going to do another round. We're going to get some of the middle and high schools. We are going to be very open about these results, which is why we've been having little updates on almost every show. So they're now finished with both rounds, and the total is they tested about 3,000 fixtures at 89 schools. And the fixtures, it's important to note, this is not like a Flint, Michigan thing where they think the whole water supply is contaminated. This is drinking fountains, sinks, older fixtures that may have lead in some way that can leach into the water as it comes through that fixture. So out of those 89 schools, 48, everything tested okay within the safe limits. 41 had unsafe levels in at least one fixture. And of course, the real challenge has been, so what do you make of that? Some of those fixtures are almost never used. You know, they may be in an old part of the building. They may be, you know, and some of them, we talked about Geringer High had a drinking fountain in the cafeteria that had extremely high levels. So something like that, then you're getting to who drank that and how much, and that's really an open question. So then to me, almost the more shocking news, I had not been following Iredell Statesville schools had said, and the side note to this is that preschools, child care centers are required to test their water. School systems are not, but more and more of them are doing that. So Iredell Statesville said, okay, CMS is doing this, maybe we should do this. Oh, and by the way, they're also investigating a cluster of thyroid cancer in this area. And there is a chemical called, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, perchlorate, which is linked to thyroid cancer. Would not normally be part of the water testing, but they said, well, maybe we should check for that just in case. It's a chemical that's manufactured for use in rocket propellant and fireworks. I'm not sure why it would.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like something you want to drink.
Yeah. And lo and behold, they got a high level at Lake Norman High School, which is now using bottled water until they figure out exactly what's going on. And they do have a very high level of thyroid cancer per 100,000 people. Let's see, it was in Iredell County, it had increased from 7.5 cases per 100,000 people to 23.7 cases.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
But in that area where Lake Norman High, the rate went from 4.1 cases in the 1990s to 34.6 cases by 2016. Now, again, the more you get into a small area, the more you have smaller numbers and you can see extreme fluctuations. But understandably, people are very concerned about what's going on there.
And cancer cluster investigations take a really long time. There's lots of different factors. So it may be a while before we get, or even if they do come up with conclusive findings, it's really hard to prove things like that.
And South Iredell is an area that's been growing really fast. So part of this is a lot of people moving from somewhere else. Were they even exposed here? So
yeah,
I think that's another issue.
I imagine you'll be keeping a close eye on that in the future.
I never thought plumbing would be a part of my beat. Here we are.
See, you go in all kinds of directions in education. So Ann is talking a little bit about matters that touch on the environment, David, and I believe you were there this week when former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg came to town, not just to visit with Mayor Vi-Lyles, but to discuss the environment. What was he up to?
He made an announcement this week that Charlotte is one of 20 cities around the country that are getting grants and technical assistance through a city's climate change program that his foundation runs. The city will get $2.5 million over the next 2 years, plus training and other assistance to help the city meet its climate change goals. If you remember back in June, the city council passed a resolution setting some goals for the city to reduce its carbon emissions by 2050 and city buildings and city vehicles by 2030, and this program will help with that. That's one of the reasons that Charlotte was picked for this. Practically speaking, it will mean that we get an extra employee in our sustainability office. But it was hard to take a look at Bloomberg speaking on a podium with the Charlotte skyline in the back this week and not think about other things like, is he running for president? And he didn't actually say anything about that. Somebody asked him about it, and he said, well, I'll come back for the coffee, because apparently he really liked the cup of coffee he had at 7th Street Public Market. But anyway, this program will give the city some help over the next few years to reach this really ambitious goal. Part of it is stuff that the city can do by itself, like switching to electric vehicles. And part of it is going to call on us citizens to reduce our carbon emissions by thinking differently about the way we drive, the way we heat and cool our homes, and that sort of thing. So that'll be a story that we're watching over the next 30 years or so.
By the way, go ahead.
They put up some pretty ambitious goals for us to reduce them, which will be quite a challenge. But I was going to touch base on, the fact that here he is in a battleground state, Michael Bloomberg, and he's going to be one of the incredible amounts of folks tossing their hat into the ring, maybe in 2020. The Democratic Party has just announced their schedule for debates, and it's pretty extensive, and they might have to have a tiered stadium seating because there'll be so many people.
And Mary, this won't surprise you. He did take a couple of jabs at President Trump's environmental policy. And also, Bloomberg is now a Democrat again. Remember, he was a Democrat, then he was a Republican, then he was an independent, now he's a Democrat.
Yeah, I heard him speak at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia when he finally came in and talked about Hillary Clinton, endorsed her, and of course warned the country, he said, about Donald Trump's business practices. So it'll be interesting to see. And it also, the country under the Trump administration has taken itself out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's pretty interesting that Charlotte's one of those cities that's actually signed on to continue their involvement with it.
Yeah, but mayors have not taken themselves out of it, and they have committed, even if the federal government doesn't do it, we will do something. And that was one of the comments that Bloomberg made, which was, mayors get this even if Congress and the White House don't.
By the way, one quick digression, David, since you and I were both there. This was one of the oddest press events I've been to, in that there was a sort of 30-minute pregame show, if you will, where we all stood around and watched Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor Lyles have coffee, but we weren't close enough to hear what they were saying. So I'm not sure, is that, anybody been to an event where you watch people drink coffee?
I think that just lends more credence to the idea that this was a big photo op for Michael Bloomberg in some yet to be announced future campaign. I mean, one of his press aides I said, what's going to be happening here? It's B-roll. It's a photo op for the press here. Right?
Maybe next time you can be one of the people pretend to serve the coffee and kind of listen in a little bit,
By the way, I saw Michael Bloomberg paying for Vi Lyle's coffee.
Yes.
So.
Oh, that's nice of him.
There we go. See? Well,
he does have his own island or something.
Well,
right?
I was going to say, I checked it this week. He's only worth about $47 billion, according to Forbes. So,
he could buy 7th Street Market if he likes it.
Yeah, he could. Yeah, I like the coffee. I'll just take the market.
He won't have to worry about campaign financing.
That's right. That's right. Speaking of big bucks, David, I wanted to ask you, because I think you were following a little bit of the incentives game. We've had a number of major jobs announcements, and this week we had Avid Exchange. The governor was back in town. Politicians love a good jobs announcement, don't they? So what's going on with this slew of economic news here?
We've had 4 announcements in December in Charlotte alone, plus others around the state. Tens of millions of dollars in incentives at both the state and local level. The latest one was a technology company called Cognizant, which is already in Charlotte, and that's another theme here.
Yes.
Companies already here are getting more incentives to stay here. But Cognizant says it's going to expand its workforce. They've got 960 people right now. They're going to add another 300 jobs over the next few years. They're getting a couple $1 million in state incentives and $138,000 in city and county incentives. They're a company that they're a technology services company. They also specialize, somewhat controversially, in offshoring jobs. So it's some question a few years ago when they got $5 million the first time around. Is this a company we want to be supporting here? But there are jobs coming to Charlotte for this. Also this week we heard that Avid Exchange, which has its headquarters at the Music Factory here in Uptown, bringing another 1,200 jobs to Charlotte, and they're investing $42 million in another building over there at the Music Factory area. And they're getting, $20 million in state incentives and a few $1 million in city and county incentives. And these are on top of other recent announcements from Honeywell and LendingTree that we've talked about. Altogether, 2,700 jobs announced in Charlotte in December. Big numbers for economic development incentives as well. Tarek Bakari on Facebook, I noticed this morning, was kind of putting up side by side these economic development announcements along with the city's push for affordable housing going hand in hand. Clearly, we're going to need the affordable housing if these big bucks jobs come here. So.
And also it'll be a strain on the folks who are here to get that affordable housing, as every city with tech and high-paying jobs it's been happening that, what happens to the folks who are making just, middle-class salaries. So that's a challenge.
And I want to mention, David, you made note of the incentives. I think it's something like $127 million combined for all those companies, but I think the number that caught everyone's attention was the incentives package that was not accepted, which was $271 million for Amazon, right?
That's right. That's a huge number. And I mean, just think about it. What we talked about for these jobs is, less than half of that number. One question I have is, where would the city and county have gotten the money to pay for these incentives? I mean, think about what a drain that would have been in one way or another on the incentive possibilities here. Alex and I were talking about this yesterday. Mm-hmm. She wonders if we would have been able to do any of these incentive grants without, if we had to spend money on Amazon.
Yeah, and Raleigh was offering even more, I believe.
277.
Yeah, I know. So North Carolina was all in there.
And the state would have offered $2.2 billion on top of that. So that's not bad. That's a lot of prime orders, right? Well, we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank my guests, Alex Olgan from WFAE, David Borax from WFAE, Andos Helms of the Charlotte Observer, and Mary C. Curtis from WCCB and Roll Call. That is all for the local news roundup this week. Thank you so much for listening to Charlotte Talks on WFAE.